aloe vera cactus.
Why? Good evening. We haven't even really got the icebreaker contract yet, though we should. And already there are fears in Vancouver, nothing to do with that contract, that hundreds and hundreds of jobs could be threatened. We're going to talk about that tonight, but first here's Ted with a rundown.
Tonight on Webster, are Canada's sanctions against South Africa enough? Walter McLean, Tory MP for Waterloo, says no and suggests we escalate our efforts. He's back from a trip to Mozambique for Oxfam and says South Africa is backing terrorists to wage war against its peaceful neighbors. But first, will amendments to the Western Grain Transportation Act hurt Canadian ports? That's the worry of the grain workers and longshoremen's unions. They fear their jobs are on the line if the changes are adopted. In the studio with Webster, Don Garcia, President of the International Longshoremen's Union, and Henry Kanks, Secretary-Treasurer for the Grain Workers Union.
And it's a kind of unusual occasion tonight, gentlemen, in that we're not discussing a labour dispute. We're discussing potential federal legislation from the Tories. Now, why can you gentlemen go along with this proposition that we might lose 1,200 jobs and a lot of our container trade if this simple little amendment to the Western Grain Transportation Act goes through?
Well, it might be a simple a little amendment, but it has far-reaching impact on all Canadians, in my opinion. And Henry, I know, shares that opinion. And all Canadians should. We subsidize the grain. We pay for that out of our pockets to the extent of $22 to $24 a ton. With this amendment, what it will do is actually stop ships from calling into the Port of Vancouver, the infrastructure of which was paid for by Canadian taxpayers. Will force the ships then, well, won't force them, they'll happily go down south, and we'll lose the trade that we presently have looked so hard to get.
Now, this specific amendment would do what?
Well, first, they're saying that this amendment will only apply to containers and specialty grains. But as soon as you take that word out, export, and change the definition, then all grains will be affected. And that goes for barley, rye, rapeseed, and finally wheat. They're
going to remove the definition of export. And what would that allow to be done that cannot be done at the moment on the subsidized transportation?
What happens now is that the containers, that the grain, has to go out through a Canadian port. The taking out of that simple word would mean that the containers could go across the line down to Seattle. And as everyone knows now, it's been well publicized, many containers are trucked up here. And what this would do is provide a lucrative backhaul for those same trucks to divert cargo to the United States of America.
You're saying they've opened the door for the use of our subsidized transportation for the grain producers to ship through Seattle-Tacoma.
That's right. The grain cars, the hopper cars, will go directly from prairie provinces to Tacoma, to Seattle, or Portland.
But that's crazy. I mean, we're subsidizing how much? The transportation subsidized, what you said, $30 a ton?
About 22 to 24 on an average per ton. So we're paying for something like $658 million a year.
We pay that on each, and now this subsidy will apply to grain container cargoes and could apply to all cargoes, could it?
Well, not to all cargoes, but specifically to grain.
Could apply to on everything that comes from the prairies to Seattle, Tacoma. What about Portland?
Well, they can go to Portland, they can go to Kalama on the Columbia River. Those elevators are empty at the present time. They're hungry for product. And if this is allowed to continue, it will not only take the jobs away, there'll be a loss in port revenues, there'll be create more unemployment, which costs more in the overall picture, and lose other things that we fought so hard to get.
So they take away, delete the export definition, and it means that that subsidized transportation could be used on any American port as well as Canadian ports.
That's correct.
What's the ration? Have you met with Horner, you gentlemen?
Yes, we met with Horner.
What did he tell you? I mean, how does he rationalize this?
Oh, Mr. Horner is saying that the producers want this in the prairies. Much he means Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. But only a small percentage of the producers really understand what's this all about. I do not believe that the farmers are told the true facts and do know really what's going on.
Mm-hmm. But it's still, I know what you're getting at. You're telling me that the subsidies will be applied on trips of grain exports. Aren't they restricting it specifically to specific malts and barleys?
Not necessarily. That's what Mr. Horner told us. But according to the change in the Act, as soon as that word export is removed, when the definition is removed, then it applies to all grains.
Now, this obviously is a big help to Seattle, which is more than willing to take advantage of that. Explain again the backhaul provision. What, would we lose any of our very expensive tax-paid hopper cars, which are much better than the American ones, would we?
Yes, the way it stands now, 8 American President lines and Sealand, which do not call into Vancouver at all. And if this definition goes in, then the cargo could flow across the states to these 2 particular lines, which are huge lines, and then find their way overseas to the markets. While the way it works now, the ships come up here specifically to pick up this cargo.
Up to Vancouver?
Up to Vancouver, and they drop off boxes, containers, and load the grain, load these specialty grains. 25% of the inbound containers are made up of specialty grains. 307 metric tons went through the port in 1986.
307, you say?
307,000.
307,000. Now, that means, therefore, that if they can pick up their specialty grains for export in Seattle, with this grain being subsidized by the Canadian taxpayer mugs, $20-odd a ton, you say?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That means they wouldn't have to bring the ships into Vancouver at all.
No, they wouldn't. No.
At the moment, they've got to come here to get this specific type of cargo.
That's correct.
Now, the bill is not anywhere near law yet, is it, gentlemen?
Not yet, but it's a matter of time.
That's why we are here, really, to bring to the attention of the Canadian taxpayer that they're going to have to pay for a service that grants us nothing.
Well, you're all united, I know, on this, but this manager's report from the City Hall said the specialty grain traffic currently handled by the Port of Vancouver will be lost, putting at risk the Port of Vancouver's entire container trade, which currently stands at 185,000 two-way units annually. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's correct, yes.
On a long-term haul, it could threaten the whole damn kit and caboodle of container trades.
Well, once they remove the incentive for those ships to come in,
right, I see what you mean.
Then the erosion starts.
Now, Crosby's the minister in charge. Has he been front and center? I'm sorry, wasn't aware of this when I interviewed Crosby the other week. Has he been outspoken about it at all, Henry?
Mr. Crosby promised to come to Vancouver Saturday, and we're going to meet with Mr. Crosby and the rest of the MPs from Western Canada, Conservative MPs in Vancouver, and we'll have discussions concerning this change of these words, would they propose to be changed, and we'll see what he has to say about it.
He's got to back down, hasn't he?
Well, I'd say he should. In all clear conscience, I don't know. We asked Mr. Horner and Mr. Thompson, who are charged with the obligation of the study, as to what their rationale was for asking for this change, and they never did give us a direct answer. They said it was cost. They weren't concerned about the viability of the Port of Vancouver.
Now, these freight rate subsidies I see here, they amount to 80% of the total rail costs.
Yes.
Would apply to all export grain, whether shipped through Canadian or U.S. ports.
That's correct.
Now, we're stuck with the subsidies anyway, but surely all they have to do is take out U.S. ports.
Well, they just have to leave the definition of export by water in there.
Now, one other point, though. Can we, in Vancouver waterfront, be faulted for holding up export grains? Can somebody turn around and say, oh, we've got to use the American ports and let them have the subsidized transport to meet our customers' needs?
Definitely not. We are beating all records by shipping Canadian grain through Vancouver, for instance, on Prince Rupert. Every record is broken. Now, how can anybody fault us for stopping or impairing Canadian grain exports?
That's a good point. I've been talking to Don Garcia, the president of the Canadian area of the ILWU, and to Henry Kanks, the Secretary-Treasurer of the Grain Workers Union. Don't know what kind of calls we'll whistle up on this, but it's time people know about it after the break. Singapore. Mind you, it's only a small group of grain producers and multi-barley interests that want to do this, because they say that the capacity and costs are maybe better than in Vancouver, elsewhere down the coast.
Yes, they can say that, but that's not. This is not true. Mr. Horner believes, and that Mr. Thompson believes, and the facts are that the costs are completely different.
You mean we can compete all the time?
Any time we can compete.
Go ahead, please.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
I just got one question here on this backhaul provision, because I know a little of the transportation, and right now the Montana Senator, Sam Baucus, is bringing in a provision for licensing for Canadian truckers to cross the line. It's a $500 border fee. And with this talk of deregulation in the States, and they're putting pressure back east now on all Canadian trucking operations, you know, the Americans will be up here backhauling those containers out of here, and there's a lot of jobs in the trucking industry.
Just a minute. Isn't that what you told me, that the Americans would be backhauling the containers?
Right.
The other point I wanted to clear was when a hopper car disappears into the States, it's lost for use here, and it might be there, what, 5 or 6 months?
Yes, and those cars are paid for by Canadian taxpayers.
And our cars are in better shape than the American cars.
Oh, yes, they're excellent.
But this whole thing is deregulation and free trade. We're going to have to take a real serious look at this.
Thank you, sir. Go ahead, please.
Jack, you've got to remember that the producers here have been suffering over the last 20 to 25 years with the fact that these people in the Port of Vancouver have been holding up grain shipments with strikes and lockouts and this type of thing. The producer is getting the lowest amount of money, or about the same amount of money he was for his product 30 years ago. They're looking at saving themselves some money. That's their input into this thing.
Are you suggesting that the only reason this is in is for fear of labor strife on the waterfront?
Oh, I think that's a factor in it. I'm not saying that's the only thing.
Okay, let's try that with Don.
Well, if you go back in the history and really examine the history of strikes or lockouts in the longshore industry, you'll find that since 1976, if you average out the days, it amounts to 10 days a year.
10 days a year.
That's all.
But then you have weather hold-ups you can't avoid, can you?
Sometimes it happens on prairies and.
Well, Jack, I don't have the opportunity to have all the research here, but I know in the prairies when this port has been closed, the frustration for the farmers, and why not go out there and
well, let me put it this way. I don't want it to be shipped down, subsidized by the Canadian taxpayers to Portland. If it's not subsidized, that can be free enterprise, but it's subsidized, no way. Am I right, gentlemen?
You are correct.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, my point that I want to make is that the people on the world market that are buying Canadian grain, if they know that the labor force can hold up basically, you know, the shipment and whatever, I'd like to see it be able to go through the States so that the Canadian farmer is given a better chance to sell his product.
That doesn't seem to have been presented as a reason for this redefinition of export, allowing it to go to the U.S., does it?
No, it wasn't.
Wasn't brought up in that way at all. Go ahead, please.
Yes, my question is, because of the container clause, which has been the result of a lockout, and they're talking about having the trucks a lucrative business, why don't they just work on eliminating the container clause before more traffic is lost in grain and in...
Okay, let's put that to Don. You've got an arbitration decision coming down on the container clause as a result of the federal legislation. When is it, May or June?
May the 30th, the Industrial Inquiry Commissioner will give his report.
Does that have any relationship to this particular problem?
None at all. The fact is that one arm of government is saying that the container clause must go, and another arm of government is saying we're going to eliminate it anyway.
Go ahead, please, from Victoria.
Hi, Jack. I certainly enjoyed this show of yours.
Good.
And each time I listen to it, it's always this government's selling us down the river between the grain workers, the forestation workers, the IWA, the unions, and there's this deal on the polar 8. Is there no way that we could all get together and put a vote of no confidence in this government and get them to hell out of there?
There certainly is, and a man with your accent should know the answer. If everybody joins the same political party, and then it'll split into opposing groups, and we'll be back. It's the best system we know how. We're stuck with them.
Another question I would like to put to you. If every family in Victoria would just put $1 towards this national debt, it would get us out of there.
What have you been into tonight? He's hardly on the topic. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack. I think your guest tonight should just take a hint. I mean, they've they've cut their own throats here. They've had this stuffing and destuffing clause. They've totally destroyed the whole purpose of the container industry. You know, you can't blame the farmers for trying to get their product to market at the best deal and the most efficient means. And I think these guys have slit their own throats.
Gentlemen?
Well, I'll tell you, Jack, that it's maybe we've slit our own throats, but we're not in this alone. The Chamber of Shipping, the shipping lines, the Vancouver Port Corporation, we're all together on this one.
Maritime Employers Association.
I'm glad to hear you admit that you have contributed to slitting your own throats, but I think you guys should take a hint and try and get things moving efficiently like they do in the States, and you can hardly blame Canadian producers for sending containers and grain down south.
I think maybe with somebody's missed a point along the line. They're changing the definition of export so that subsidized transportation rates apply in American ports and not just Canadian ports, thereby diverting legitimate traffic from the Port of Vancouver and threatening a hell of a lot of jobs.
That's correct.
And that's the situation regardless of what happened yesterday or the day before. Go ahead, please.
Hello. I think the one point that's being missed here is like on Ridley Island that is being subsidized by the Canadian taxpayers and was paid for by Canadian taxpayers is going to become another come-by chance like in Newfoundland there where they built the oil refinery.
Well, Ridley Island happens to be shipping coal.
They also ship grain.
Do they ship grain from Ridley Island too?
They do.
But not specialty grains.
I don't get your point at all there.
Well, with the changes right now on the just being specialty grain, in the long run it's not going to just be specialty grain, it's going to be all grain. So therefore, Ridley Island won't be shipping grain out of there either.
Well, I think you've contributed a lot to the discussion tonight, gentlemen, and you've sold me on the fact that it seems to be crazy to subsidize, for us to subsidize $25 a ton freight of grain to United States port. Yeah, I think you'll win this battle easy.
Well, I hope we win because it'll be a win for all Canadians.
When does Crosby come?
Saturday.
You're going to have a bash with Crosby on Saturday.
Yes.
My thanks to Don Garcia of the ILWU and Henry Kanks of the Grain Workers Union. Thank you, gentlemen. I shall be back after the break.
Thank you.
I'm just having a little geography lesson. I'll share it with you later. I've got Walter McLean, MP for Waterloo. He's a Tory, of course, and he's just back from Mozambique. And I was just asking him precisely where is Mozambique, and we didn't have time to do a little map. Can you come in that map? Here I am in Madagascar. Here I am in Mozambique, tiny wee place, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and South Africa. Now, what were you doing over there, Walter?
Well, Jack, I went along with a group of Canadians from the media, some from the cultural area, and 3 or 4 of our well-known non-governmental agencies on behalf of the Government of Canada on a fact-finding trip about one of the worst tragedies going on in Africa at the present. We've become accustomed to thinking of tragedy in Africa, and this one is linked very closely to South Africa.
This is the place where, is it not, this not the place where Mulroney got up and said, I can understand violence?
We're dealing with an ongoing war in Mozambique at the moment.
Who's fighting the war in Mozambique?
At the moment, the Mozambicans are fighting what they call RENAMO, which is a front organization for the South Africans. And there's an ongoing war, which has been really ongoing since they became independent in 1975. First of all, as an independent nation, they were faced with the Rhodesian War, and they found themselves in the middle of a war situation. The Portuguese left very abruptly, left them with no trained people, very little infrastructure, and a very weak economy. Following that, they've had attack upon their infrastructure.
By whom?
By the South Africans in a front group of disaffected Mozambicans and some Portuguese who left with a great deal of ill will. So what you've got is not just in Mozambique, but in all of those countries you were pointing out to the viewers, what they're called the frontline states, whether it's Zambia or Zimbabwe or in those particular areas, a concerted plan to destabilize the area. And it's part, of course, of the defense of apartheid. If you're going to defend apartheid, you want the world to say, look at these Africans. They can't govern themselves. Look at them. The whole place is a mess. Imagine what will happen if the blacks take over in South Africa. You can see the chaos there, so it'll be just like that.
Well, how do you stand on the escalation of sanctions against South Africa?
Well, everywhere we went as a group from, and let me just tell you who were in the group, Oxfam Canada, CUSO, World Vision. We had people like Jerry Kaplan from the NDP, myself from the Conservative Party. We had some actresses, people from the media, French and English. Everywhere we went, the root cause of this devastating war, and we've got to talk for a moment about what's happening there, is apartheid, South Africa. And the issues that Prime Minister Mulroney was on when he went down to southern Africa, to the frontline states, when he heard from Mugabe and the other frontline leaders, was just this. They're destabilizing not just Mozambique, not just Botswana, not just Zambia, but the whole region. And what they do is just come in and blow up your main institutions. Supposing you're the government of Mozambique, and suddenly, over a period of the last 3 or 4 years, 42% of your hospitals are blown up. Supposing you're in a situation where all of your communications have to go south to South Africa. Suddenly they turn off your power. Suddenly they turn off your train lines. All of the communications lines that go south remain, but they blow up all the ones that go east-west. So if you're trying to move your goods from Zimbabwe and say, we want to stay away from South Africa, we'll go out to the Indian Ocean through the port of Beira or through Maputo, suddenly you find that those rail lines are blown up and you can never move anything.
Well, this is not a war that attracts much current attention, is it?
It isn't, because it's been interpreted wrongly as a civil war. And it's not a civil war, it's a part of a deliberate war to destabilize the area.
Do white South African flyers make the attacks, or are they using this Mozambique National Resistance, so-called, for the attacks?
Well, from time to time, they are directly involved. For example, when they went in commando units to the port of Beira and blew up some 30 of, tank farms with oil and petrol, it's as if they went into Burrard Inlet and suddenly set detonators.
All right.
Up.
And the famine, I suppose, is endemic in the country.
Well, what happens, of course, is you've got people trying to get areas where the terrorists are not acting, and they've secured certain areas. So what has happened now is in a country of 14 million, you've got 4 million people, what they call dislocated, dislocados. Those people are finding that they're starving, and many of them are starving in modern cities. They move in where it's secure. Of course, they can't plant. Even when they can plant, there's no seed available, and there's no petrol coming into the country. What we've got here today is a terror a country stricken by terror. You've got enormous famine going on. They estimate there may be 400,000 people there. UNICEF, looking at this, says that there's one of the greatest children's tragedies going on. And I have to compliment our Canadian agencies, because we haven't had much Canadian involvement in Mozambique. The reason that you and I are looking on the map to find out where Mozambique is, it was not a part of the British or French colonial orbit. It was a Portuguese. When the Portuguese left was only recently, and as I said, they've been in a war situation since.
But Walter, what can we do? Can we take the whole cares of all the world on our shoulders, bring in everybody, rehabilitate Mozambique?
Well, Jack,
we're just a wee nation.
Just as in South Africa and apartheid, we're not doing it alone. We're doing it with the Commonwealth. We're doing it with Western European nations in terms of sanctions and the industrial power. Similarly, the needs of the frontline states that are a part of what's called SADC, the Southern Africa Development Coordination Conference, we are playing a part in it. Canada, you rightly say, can't do it. We're not going to...
Can't do it all.
Can't do it all. But we are taking our part in terms of trying to open the corridors, help these countries become self-sufficient, train some of their leadership, so that they don't have to be dependent on everything for South Africa.
How much aid do we give to Mozambique?
Mozambique,
a couple of million, maybe.
No, Mozambique at the moment, on a government-to-government basis, given the enormous famine situation, is something over $20 million dollars, in much of it in emergency food aid. Others directed through CUSO and Oxfam, who are working in trying to do basic health care and other
you're
issues.
Basically, as a Tory, if you had to implement the policy yourself, would totally sanctionize South Africa.
Well,
wouldn't you?
We would like to do that. The Prime Minister has said so, but of course we can't do it alone. Canada doesn't have massive investments, and we can only do it in concert with others. We've seen when sanctions are broken, unless there's enough common will between the nations, it won't work.
Mind you, a lot of people still think, you know, while they despise apartheid, at the same time they say, why make things worse for the poor blacks?
Well, the Prime Minister...
In other words, you've got to make it worse before it gets better, before they rise up in bloody revolution.
The Prime Minister of Botswana, the frontline state, made it quite clear to me. He said, look, the major trading partners must not use us as an excuse for doing nothing. He said, don't come and tell us that it's hurting us. We know it's hurting us because we have sanctions on us now. The sanctions are...
Botswana is one of the native states within the Union of South Africa.
No, Botswana is just to the north. Botswana is one of the... Independent. But the sanctions are put on by South Africa, saying you will only have so much travel, you'll only have so much power, you'll only have so much of all of the ingredients you need, and we'll cut it off whenever we feel like it. So when we talk about putting sanctions on, let's be quite clear. Sanctions are already on those states that border.
From South Africa?
From South Africa.
Well, naturally, they're going to make life terribly difficult for if they can weaken the likes of Mozambique, Botswana, Zimbabwe. There's no communication between Zimbabwe and South Africa now, is there?
There's continued communication because they still are dependent for much of their shipping out through the ports in South Africa, and it's only with the assistance of Canada and others as they open east-west corridors and ports and they begin to secure them that they will be able to become self-reliant.
No, but the South Africans don't let the produce or goods from Zimbabwe go south through their ports, do they?
Oh, they do indeed, because they need the income from it. And in fact, the worst thing that can happen to South Africa is that no longer are their ports needed for all of the 9 frontline ports.
The penny drops. In other words, the alternative east-west lines would let the native states' goods go out through the Beira into the Indian Ocean.
Into the Indian Ocean.
That's why they bomb them.
And that's exactly right. Because you want it's going to directly affect your income. And secondly, if you begin to have strength above, it is going to give a vote of confidence for the black population in South Africa.
Political science, social study with Walter McLean, just back from Mozambique. That was one of the great slave trading headquarters, wasn't it?
It was in the past. Let me say one word before right now, because many Canadians, knowing that there's a famine and a human need equal to Ethiopia 2 or 3 years ago, will want to know who knows something about it. I'm here briefing the CUSO people, Oxfam, World Vision, or through the churches.
We might find a vast disinterest. We'll check it with calls after the break. Walter McLean, MP for Waterloo. That's Ont, isn't it? Waterloo, Ont?
Waterloo, Ontario.
That's the prosperous part of Canada. Go ahead to Walter McLean, please.
Yes, Mr. McLean. Is Mozambique and many of the other, what you call frontline states, are they not communist or Marxist governments at this time?
That's been one of the very popular illusions, particularly about Mozambique. Immediately after independence, of course, they were caught into the situation of the Rhodesian War next to them. They found the war on their territory. They appealed to the world for arms, and you can guess who helped them for arms in that struggle.
But is it any kind of informal democracy, the man is asking?
Yeah, the question, let me come around to it. They've gone through a period where they were looking to the east. In 1982, they moved to the west and said, look, we want to begin to become truly non-aligned, and in fact, we want to begin to get the kind of assistance we see the other frontline states getting within the Commonwealth and within that association.
Well, most of those frontline states are communist states. The people are flowing from those states, trying to get into South Africa for a better economic life. And it seems to me that the press has bent this thing and used this, bent this thing right out of shape. Any of the moderates and people that really try to bring some sense to this whole situation just don't get a hearing, and yet you can bring over the guy that got the Peace Prize, and he runs all over the country and is made a hero out of because he's got this Peace Prize, which has become a farce.
Well, let me, I presume you're talking about Bishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa.
I'm talking about him, but what kind of a hearing does the other people get in the press in the United States? They get totally ignored. In Canada, they get ignored if they come over to tell their side of the story. Other black leaders that are moderates and are against apartheid, yes, but they can see that the government is trying to...
Oh, yeah, I had Buthelezi on. He'd probably found out. What do you say to that?
Well, I say quite simply that we are dealing with the most sophisticated propaganda machinery in the world at the moment out of the South African government. And the South African government's number one aim is to portray all of those who would oppose apartheid as being communist.
But my contention is...
Hold on a second.
Let me say, in my own experience in living in Africa for some 5 years and in returning on this special assignment, I find a deeply rooted church, Roman Catholic, Protestant, evangelical. I find them deeply present. I was with Alan Bosak at the Southern Africa Conference in Montreal last weekend, leader of the Reformed Church internationally. I found when I worshipped in Botswana, I'm a Presbyterian, a vibrant Presbyterian Congregationalist church. When I was in Mozambique, I worshipped with the Presbyterian Church of Mozambique, and I found the Roman Catholic Church on the ground. Let me just suggest that all of Southern Africa is communist is to not understand what is happening. It is the fastest growing area of the Christian faith. And I want to say for a moment, this illusion, this propaganda from South Africa is what we hear and what we find in the media is the result of a one-way piece. Part of what our fact-finding mission found was here are governments wanting to move to the West, asking for our help, and is our caller saying, because in the past, in seeking help, they looked east and they're now looking west, we should turn our back on them?
One cannot expect democracies to arise emergent from nationalist strife after years of colonial domination by the very people of whom you were talking. Remember when old Livingston went to Africa with a Bible in one hand and trade in the other hand?
Well, part of our policy now and the discussions that the Prime Minister had when he was there is how can we strengthen democratic institutions, the courts, the police, the training, and the parliamentary process.
If I were an African nationalist suffering from apartheid and grievous oppression, I would turn to those who would give me most help quickest. And if it's the Russians, I might pick up their system.
Any port in a storm. And in the case of Mozambique, where this enormous tragedy is on, when they asked for help, they got it. And now they're beginning to say it really wasn't worth it. It's not where we want to go in the long haul.
Go ahead to Walter McLean, who's in fine fettle tonight.
Yes, Mr. Walter McLean.
Good evening.
We listened to Mr. Buthelezi. I've read a good deal on South Africa. And I'm saying to you, if you keep on opening your mouth about South Africa the way you do, you were 22% in Canada that's conservatives, and you're going down to about 16%. We're fed up with this line that you're peddling us. We don't believe it, and the people that tell the real truth don't believe it either.
Thank you, sir. Oh, no, too quick. Sorry. Go on. I was a little too quick with him. I didn't mean to cut him off in full flight. I apologize, sir.
Me, Jack.
That's you from Squamish.
Yes, me from Squamish. Jack, I'm an ex-merchant seaman. I spent a bit of time down in South Africa also. And I was up in Mozambique, 2 ports, Lorenzo Marques and Beira. At that time, it was Portuguese, and Mozambique was a food exporting nation. Mm-hmm. They kicked the Portuguese out, and now they're starving. And if these politicians are trying to run South Africa down the train on my account, they can stop tomorrow morning, because I don't like them anyways. As a matter of fact, I think there's too many lawyers as politicians in Canada.
And you're slightly off the topic. Mr. McLean's a Presbyterian minister. Next call. You are, aren't you?
I am, indeed.
See, I can be rude to you. You're a Presbyterian. Go ahead, please.
Well, yeah, I've never heard so much disinformation and crap in such a short period of time as I have this afternoon with Mr. McLean on there. The communists are operating in that area. In fact, the Cubans are still in Angola, and there's lots of Russian aid there. I would suggest to this man, who seems to call himself a conservative, that he go off and join the goddamn liberals.
Oh, mind your language. Mind your language.
I'm sorry about that, Jack. I'm sorry. But he should go and join the NDP, because he doesn't even know what a conservative is.
Thank you. Thank you. How do you like that, for starters?
Well, part of the reason for sending a fact-finding tour was that there is so much disinformation and misinformation. We have produced a report with some balanced background and facts about what is happening. What we're trying to do is to begin in the community, and I've been consulting with people here who have very little information but want to try and build on that.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, thank you very much. I thought the deck has been stacked again tonight, it looks like. All the South African supporters are out in force. I think that everybody should try to read the book that the Eminent Persons Group wrote, Mission to South Africa. Mm-hmm. It's not that large of a book. It's very simply wrote. It's an easy read, and it very simply explains everything in simple language that everybody can understand. The calls that just came in,
they make you weak.
Nothing can justify putting children in jail. Absolutely nothing.
Oh, no, nobody here is defending, least of all me, the South African system of apartheid. And if they'd wakened up after the war in 1947 and rearranged their plans then, something could have been achieved by now.
They're saying that give them time, give them time. They have been progressing ever since 1948, institutionalizing their racial...
okay, ma'am.
It's just...
What do you say to that, Walter?
Well, one of the things that comes home very clearly as we look hard at what is the core of South Africa is that it is a fascist, a racist state. When we were dealing with Hitler in the war years, we didn't say, let's make the death camps a little more palatable. We didn't say, let's make it a little softer, what was taking place. We said, finally, that's not acceptable in the civilized world. And however people choose to make their lot, they should be free to do that. And what we're dealing with here is the struggle here with this fascist regime. Secondly, the spin-offs of their death struggle are creating havoc for many people across that region. And in terms of the Commonwealth, in terms of the Western world, together with other nations, we're trying to be a part of a peaceful, non-violent solution to this. Not to bring South Africa to it.
You don't say violence is justified even in South Africa then, do you?
Canadians are not anxious to be a part of violence. Violence is there in South Africa. Africans are dealing with it. We're trying to bring health care, education, food into a situation in order that people can live.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
Given that the situation and the treatment of blacks in South Africa is abhorrent, after living there for 25 years and having served in the army there on the Angolan-Southwest Africa border, let me assure you that the frontline states and their leaders have for years allowed terrorists to encroach on the borders and come in and blow up places and commit sabotage, and they're getting their just desserts. The South African government is treating them exactly the same way as you would expect the U.S. to treat Canada if Canada allowed terrorists to cross the 49th parallel. And be with the other callers. You have nothing to do except to increase your popularity in this country. You're at the lowest as you've ever been in the polls. What the heck are you doing in Southern Africa, in Mozambique?
You can't really say that on a great moral issue, the issue of racial discrimination, that any government is going to be on the wrong wicket, any Canadian government. And regardless of what the problems may be with the government, this is one of the points at which Canadians recognize that in Canada, we have a nation which is tolerant, and we are part of a community, a world community, that looks at this particular situation and says, this is not a part of a civilized world. And I think we cannot disconnect the sufferings of millions of people in that region from this particular cancer. And what we're trying to do in a non-violent way and in a peaceful way is to support the whites in South Africa who want to change. And let us be quite clear, just as there are divisions in the black community, there are divisions in the white South African community.
Well, sir, Walter McLean, you've been an excellent exponent of compassion and understanding.
Let's hope the conversation keeps going, and we're looking for some response to this particular emergency in Mozambique.
And I shall be back with a free-for-all little story about mobile homes after the break.
53026, something like that.
2 years ago, I carried a report on the problems of some mobile home dwellers at Hallockton Park, and we spotlighted the case of Mrs. Edna Blisson, who had some years before, in 1982, paid $36,000 for her mobile home. And then in 1985, she discovered that she couldn't get title to her home because the dealer to whom she had paid the $36,000 hadn't passed it on to Manco Homes, who built it and sold it through the dealer. And it was a dreadful position for her to be in, and she still is in that position, in that she paid for the mobile home, she bought insurance on it, and if it had burned down, she wouldn't have been able to collect the insurance. Now, I'm glad to tell you that I took that matter up at the time with the Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs, who I think was Mr. Hewitt at the time, and under the Trade Practices Act, a similar case was reported to them from Campbell River, where the Wills, a couple called Wills, had bought a mobile home from one of these dealer outfits for $50,150. And they didn't get title either to their mobile home. However, the judge, Mr. Tyrwhitt Drake, considered this matter when it was put to him by the government's lawyers on behalf of the Wills, has ruled that despite all the complications of a mobile home not being properly stuck in the ground, that it was a conditional sale and the Wills have been given the title to their mobile home. They were in the same position, they paid the money never got to Manco, they couldn't get the title. And one of the people in Victoria was telling me this afternoon that they are quite hopeful that this will mean that the 2 or 3 cases up the Fraser Valley, as well as the one in Campbell River, will now come to a happy ending for the purchasers, in that even though their money didn't get to the manufacturer of the home, they will get title to their mobile homes. So that's tough luck on the manufacturer, of course, who had sold it through the dealer, who hadn't passed on the money to him. But he, of course, is in the position really of a big car company, which has to make sure the financing of their dealers is solid and that they get the money when they sell, when they market their mobile home. I hope I've made that clear. The Victoria decision is, by Mr. Judge Tyrwhitt Drake, that the transaction constituted a bill of sale, and even though the money didn't get to the manufacturer, those who paid the money for their mobile homes are entitled to title to their homes. Now, free-for-all. LD2 Bowen Island. Is that long distance? Go ahead, please.
Mr. Webster, I'm an avid listener to your program.
Yeah.
But I would like to say something about Mr. McLean's statements. But first of all, I would like to make a complaint about your programs regarding possibilities of phoning in from outside. I hear from your good lady that there are only 2 outside calls allowed per program. Is that so?
2 long-distance collect lines.
Oh, I see. Well, that is your rule, and that is regrettable, but here we are.
Well, you made it through this time, so say it succinctly and precisely. Is that all?
I would like to say something about the lack of objectivity shown by Mr. McLean in dealing with the South African affair. He was telling us a dismal story about the starvation at the moment in Madagascar. Now, I'm basing myself on the rather objective news we get from the British Economist.
Mozambique he was talking about.
Beg your pardon?
Mozambique.
Mozambique.
Well, keep it short, please.
And the thing is, of course, that at the moment they are dealing with very bad weather circumstances. And then, it's quite true, there is a lot of devastation caused by the guerrilla movement supported by South Africa.
Right.
But Mr. Mulroney's action is dealing with a war situation brought about by Mr. Mulroney. So if
No, he didn't bring about the war situation.
Well, it's an action of war. In my opinion, and dealing by the history of South Africa.
He said he understood the reasons for violence in certain circumstances. He said, I'm glad you got through this time. Next time, be a little bit shorter. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack. Bully for you to help the people with the mobile homes. Because people feel so small, we're pretty helpless. I happen to be 62. My great-grandfather was born in Ontario in 1835, and I'm expecting a great-grandchild. And so there would be 7 generations here. And this gentleman you had on, I'd love to see a Tory as incensed over a Canadian issue. We feel sorry for poor people that are suffering, and children especially, but I understand there's at least about 30 wars being fought throughout the world right now. And man's inhumanity to man will continue.
Yeah, but you got to show some compassion and understanding.
Oh, yes, absolutely. But I think that in BC and in Canada, in BC particularly, there are people kids that are cold and hungry. Yeah. And I think we can help our neighbor. 20 million, and that's only a beginning. I just wish they'd pay a little more attention to their constituents.
To our problems. Thank you very much, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, Mr. Webster. First of all, may I say that I'm just a recent viewer of yours, and must give you high marks for your program. I'm wondering, sir, though, if we couldn't have your show on just a little later so that I could continue to watch it, because often that I can watch it at 5 o'clock.
Well, I used to be on at 9 in the morning, which was, I found, a much more pleasant time for me, because I'm a morning person, not a night person. Now, I'm part of the 4:30 to 7 package, and I've got to tell you that we're getting an extraordinary amount of viewers, and I'm happy between 5 and 6. The news hour is the big one. It comes on at 6 o'clock. And after that, of course, we go to the highly rated programs.
I particularly liked yesterday Mr. Palmer from New Zealand.
He was good.
It was a great show, Jack.
You never know, though. When you buy a politician unseen, when you accept a politician unseen, please forgive me, you don't know what you're going to get, Politicians sometimes are not as bright as advertised, and sometimes they're much brighter than advertised. And if I have any skill in this job at all, is it in keeping an interview going. With the Deputy Premier from New Zealand last night, name quick Palmer, Geoffrey Palmer. He was terrific.
He sure was.
Bright, breezy.
And what a gentleman.
Absolutely delightful. Thank you, sir. Keep watching if you can. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Mr. Webster. I'm interested in your comments, having spoken to many different experts in the field about AIDS prevention education.
Okay, I've done many programs on it. I think it's a shame that television committee turned down these milk and water versions of commercials.
Right.
I am convinced that the gravity of this epidemic is such that even if sensitivity is troubled, commercials must not be nice little patsy family group commercials. So grave is the danger. I'm all in favor almost some sensitivity, but direct and blunt commercials, beginning with education early in the schools and carried on all our media.
Now, why do you think that there hasn't been any push to get parents educated as opposed to children?
Let me tell you this,
that we're really concentrating
just
on...
a minute, I'll come back to that. I'll do a whole program on it one night. But the media in this country so far has done a great job in public education on AIDS and will continue so to do, and I shall be back after the break. John Turner will be here tomorrow night, the John Turner, and also Dr. John Polanyi, the Canadian Nobel Prize-winning scientist. Should be a good program tomorrow night. I'll do another one on AIDS soon, however, and I'll be back 5 p.m. precisely.